The Wednesday sewing circle at St. Luke's Parish Hall had never before been accused of generating excitement. Its members prided themselves on the quiet industry of their needles and the even quieter industry of their opinions, both of which were generally sharp but rarely scandalous. On this particular damp morning, the windows were fogged over. The vicar's wife was distributing tepid tea with an air of mild martyrdom, and Mrs. Serena Bletchley, the newest widow in Flaxborough, was dozing gently in her chair. Her needle had slipped from her fingers some minutes earlier, unnoticed except by Mrs. Wiveton, who kept a vigilant watch on other people's laps. Serena's chin rested delicately on the collar of her dark coat. A few strands of silver hair trembled each time she exhaled. She looked, in short, like a woman whose grief had worn her down to a polite, manageable fatigue, the kind that polite society preferred. It was into this peaceful, faintly soporific scene that the odd event intruded. Serena's head jerked slightly, a ripple passed through her shoulders, then, in a soft but distinctly audible voice, she murmured, "Edgar Felpish, don't." Her eyes remained closed. Her posture did not change, but the name, and the warning note in her tone, sent a sudden chill through the room that had nothing to do with the faulty church radiators. 5 of the women stopped sewing. 2 dropped their threads entirely. The vicar's wife froze in the act of pouring tea, creating a tiny brown tide on the saucer of Mrs. Dowsett, who did not notice. She was staring at Serena with something between fascination and horror. No one spoke. The rain continued to patter against the windows like an impatient audience waiting for Act 2. Then Serena slumped forward with a faint sigh, her body folding slightly, as though the utterance had cost her more strength than she possessed. Her chair creaked in mild protest. Mrs. Wiveton was the first to find her voice. "Did you hear that?" she hissed, as though half afraid the name might still be lingering in the air. "Perfectly clearly," said Mrs. Dowsett, who prided herself on her hearing and her moral indignation. "Edgar Felpish, and telling him not to do something. Oh, dear me." "Who's Edgar Felpish?" asked a younger woman, new to the circle and to the town. The question produced several sharp inhalations, for in Flaxborough it was generally expected that new arrivals educate themselves on local scandals before joining a parish group. "Drowned," Mrs. Wiveton supplied ominously. 5 years ago, poor man fell in by the old lock at Bishop's Wharf. Tragic business. They held a lovely service. Serena attended, I recall, though she insisted she hardly knew him. The vicar's wife set down her teapot with unusual force. "We must see to her at once. Mrs. Maldon, fetch some water. Mrs. Brigsby, open a window, not too widely, mind. We don't want her catching a further chill." It took several minutes of fanning, fussing, and whispered commentary before Serena stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she regarded the half-circle of anxious faces as if they had materialized from the fog. "What?" she began, then winced. "Oh, I must have drifted off." "You spoke," Mrs. Dowsett ventured. "Did I? How embarrassing. I hope I didn't snore." "No," said Mrs. Wiveton, leaning forward with the eagerness of someone about to strike gold. "You said a name, Edgar Felpish." A pallor, distinct from her natural complexion, spread across Serena's features. "I said Edgar, but why?" "That is what we hoped you could tell us," the vicar's wife said gently, with the tone of someone who very much hoped the answer would be interesting, but not legally fraught. But Serena merely shook her head, and there was something in the gesture, not terror exactly, but a species of weary apprehension that made the women pause in their speculation. "I'm dreadfully sorry," she murmured. "I don't know why I would say such a thing." Before further interrogation could begin, Serena's shoulders sagged, her eyes fluttered once more, and she fainted with the quiet decisiveness of a woman who had found the day's excitement quite sufficient. News travels fast in Flaxborough, faster still when assisted by ladies whose weekly outing had just been upended by a name resurrected from the river. By the time Constable Malley arrived, summoned reluctantly from his rounds, the incident had tripled in drama, acquired elements of prophecy, and gained a supposed connection to a missing tin of biscuits. Malley listened with the expression of a man accustomed to sorting fact from embroidery, and resigned to the latter winning by sheer volume. "I expect she's just overtired," he said, scribbling nothing in his notebook. "Widows often are." Mrs. Wivton drew herself up in outrage. "Constable, Serena Bletchley has spoken a dead man's name in her sleep. That is not overtired. That is ominous." Malley's moustache tilted in a way meant to suggest respectful skepticism. "Ominous, is it?" "It is when the dead man was thought to have drowned under irregular circumstances," Mrs. Dowsett added, hoping the phrase irregular circumstances made her sound knowledgeable. Malley sighed. "I'll mention it to Inspector Pubright," which, given Malley's track record, meant that Purbright would hear of it after lunch, if at all. Yet the inspector did hear, over a sandwich in fact, and though he made no visible fuss, he did decide to take a small detour on his walk back to the station. The churchyard beside St. Luke's was especially bleak in the drizzle. Moss-coated stones leaned at uncertain angles, as though bowing to the inevitability of gossip. Purbright stood by the lich gate, hands clasped behind his back, as he watched two women assist Serena Bletchley toward her cottage on Candlewick Lane. Their umbrellas bobbed like suspiciously large black mushrooms. Something in the scene, the stiffness of Serena's walk, the quick glances exchanged by her companions, or perhaps the way the vicar's wife hovered just a little too near, unsettled Purbright in a way he could not immediately articulate. He frowned slightly, gazing past the gravestones toward the mist-shrouded wharf beyond. "Edgar Felpish," he murmured, tasting the name as though testing a long-forgotten tune. A curious business indeed. And, Purbright reflected, curious businesses seldom turned out to be wholly imaginary in Flaxborough. He stepped away from the gate, his thoughts quiet, deliberate, and already stirring. By early afternoon, the incident at St. Luke's Parish Hall had swollen to twice its natural size and acquired the dramatic weight of a minor haunting. Flaxborough, with its pleasant facades and determinedly uneventful routines, possessed a remarkable talent for magnifying the slightest oddity into civic folklore. And so it was that Serena Bletchley's fainting spell and murmured invocation of Edgar Felpish, a man more notable in death than he had ever been in life, became the principal subject of animated discourse. The first embellished reports trickled through the high street shops like a slow but persistent leak. At the bakery, Mrs. Wivton gave her own rendering of the event, full of pious sorrow and an unmistakable thrill. She described Serena's voice as eerily deep, almost masculine, though several women in the sewing circle would later insist the widow had barely whispered. At the ironmonger's, Mrs. Dowsett claimed Serena had cried Edgar's name twice, once accompanied by a gasp that sounded remarkably like, "Please." Meanwhile, the vicar's wife, who prided herself on keeping the town's moral temperature steady, quietly informed the grocer that Serena's collapse had been accompanied by a peculiar shaking, almost like a seizure, though she had seen nothing of the sort. By mid-afternoon, Edgar Felpish had been resurrected in no fewer than 3 retellings, each placing him somewhere slightly different, near the old lock on the footpath behind the parish school, or, most sensationally, by the churchyard wall, where he had apparently been seen earlier that week by a schoolboy with notoriously poor eyesight. Inspector Pubright would have been amused if he weren't already considering the matter with a degree of unease he preferred not to advertise. He had returned to the police station to find Constable Malley recounting the parish hall incident to Sergeant Chubb, embellishing it with a good deal more concern than he had displayed in the hall itself. "She went down like a sack of coal," Malley proclaimed, gesturing energetically. "And then she muttered all sorts. Might have been more than one name even." "More than one?" Purbright interjected gently. Malley turned, startled. "Sir, didn't hear you come in?" "I rarely announce myself," Purbright replied mildly. "It encourages candour. Now then, Serena Bletchley. Did she mutter more than Edgar Felpish's name?" Malley blinked, deflated slightly. "Well, no, just the one. But she did look pale as anything afterward." Purbright nodded. "Understandable. The poor woman has endured a recent bereavement and now finds herself the centre of local mythology. People are saying Felpish is back," Chubb said with a grimace. "Alive." "Flaxborough often confuses the improbable with the entertaining," Purbright murmured. "It's a local habit." Still, he could not shake the image of Serena being helped away from the parish hall, her steps stiff, her eyes unfocused, as though she were bracing herself against some internal storm. He had seen grief in many forms, but this bore the unmistakable trace of something quieter, the weight of a secret rather than mere sorrow. Wanting a clearer view of the situation, Purbright decided to approach the matter through the usual understated route, a short walk through town where gossip frequently reached him before any formal report. He began at Bellamy's bookshop, whose proprietor, Mr. Bellamy, was a model of polite discretion, but possessed a gift for hearing everything spoken in his shop, whether whispered, muttered, or, supposedly, private. As Purbright entered, the bell tinkled with a tidiness that mirrored the shop's carefully curated shelves. "Inspector?" Bellamy said, lifting his head from a ledger. "Looking for reading material or information?" "Ah," Purbright replied. "You make it sound as though the two are distinct." Bellamy smiled faintly. "Mrs. Wiveton was here earlier, bought a devotional booklet, spoke of the incident at St. Luke's, of course." Purbright clasped his hands behind his back. "Did she mention what Serena might have meant by saying Edgar Felpish's name?" Bellamy closed the ledger softly. "She didn't say what Serena meant, but she strongly implied what she wished others to think Serena meant." "It's not quite the same thing." Purbright's eyes twinkled. "Quite so." Bellamy hesitated, then added, "There is something else. The widow came in last week asking after old railway maps. 5 to 10-year-old timetables. I found it odd, but didn't inquire." Purbright felt the faint stirrings of the puzzle's edges aligning. "Did she purchase any?" "One, yes, a Lincolnshire main line schedule from 5 years back. The year of Edgar Felpish's death." "Thank you," Purbright said, and stepped back into the street. His next source of accidental intelligence was the Reverend Prideaux, who was found examining the state of the church railings with a frown suggesting personal affront. The vicar straightened at the inspector's approach. "Inspector Pubright, I suppose you've heard of the morning's disturbance." "Disturbances at the parish hall rarely escape notice," Purbright said. "You seem troubled." "Not troubled so much as curious," the Reverend admitted. "Mrs. Bletchley's late husband, Albert, came to me several times in the months before his passing, spoke of worries, though never clearly. Something about old matters resurfacing. He was a sensitive man." "Sensitive," Purbright repeated softly. "And did he speak of Edgar Felpish?" A pause. "Not directly, but he alluded to acquaintances he knew Serena had once kept quiet." "She was a private woman?" Purbright inclined his head in thanks, leaving the vicar to his railings and his moral perplexities. As he made his way toward Candlewick Lane, The drizzle thickened into a fine mist that softened the edges of the town. Serena's cottage stood modestly between two larger houses, both of which had lace curtains that twitched suspiciously whenever someone passed by. From behind one curtain, Mrs. Lummidge peered with all the subtlety of a searchlight. "Inspector," she called, stepping out before he had fully reached the gate. "You're inquiring about poor Serena, I expect." Purbright gave a polite nod. "Merely checking on her welfare?" Mrs. Lummidge leaned closer. "Well, she's resting now, so I won't disturb her for you, but I can tell you she's been troubled. Oh yes, I've seen her pacing at night, and lights on at odd hours. And yesterday, this is between us, mind, she received a letter, plain envelope, no stamp, slipped straight under the door." "A letter?" Purbright asked calmly. "Hand-delivered?" "Oh yes." And she looked white as chalk after reading it. "Did you happen to see the sender?" Mrs. Lummidge looked offended. "I am a respectable woman, Inspector. I don't spy. I merely observe the comings and goings on my street." Purbright managed not to smile. "Your restraint does you credit." He left her beaming at the compliment and approached Serena's gate, though he did not knock. Instead, he paused, watching the dim shape of her in the window, a silhouette, small, still, and folded inward like a woman guarding something fragile. The echo of her murmured words returned to him. Edgar Felpish. Don't. The name lingered not like a memory, but like a warning. Purbright stepped back from the cottage just as the church clock struck 4. Somewhere behind him, a door creaked. Not Serena's, but the house opposite, where a figure slipped quickly inside upon noticing the inspector's gaze. Flaxborough was preparing more secrets, or perhaps merely revealing old ones with renewed enthusiasm. Either way, Purbright felt the investigation settle around him like the day's mist, quietly, thoroughly, and with a persistence that promised he would not be leaving it untouched. He turned toward the station, hands behind his back, and allowed himself a single private thought. This business with Edgar Felpish was not nearly as dead as it ought to have been. Inspector Pubright arrived at the station the next morning to find Sergeant Chubb standing stiffly beside his desk, holding a file as though it were made of something volatile. The man's usual stolid calm had been replaced by a faint, self-important tension. Purbright recognized at once that a new theory had taken shape overnight, one likely crafted by the combined efforts of the council's tidiest minds and the police staff's eagerness for a straightforward explanation. "Sir," Chubb began, "a matter's come up concerning Mrs. Bletchley." Purbright removed his coat and draped it neatly over the back of the chair. "Has there been another fainting spell?" "No, sir. But we've received 3 reports, separate, about a figure lurking around Candlewick Lane yesterday evening. All describe a man, anxious-looking, hovering near the widow's cottage. One witness says he ducked behind the hedge when she came to the window." Purbright eased into his seat. "And who is this conveniently anxious figure?" Chubb opened the file. "Martin Bletchley, her nephew." The name stirred faint recollection. Purbright had seen the young man once or twice. Pale, slight, always with the anxious air of someone expecting to be scolded for something he had not yet done. "He was spotted by Mrs. Lummidge," Chubb continued, "and Mrs. Lummidge's daughter-in-law, and old Mr. Brightwell from the corner house, all agreed on the same description, nervous, evasive, and rather too interested in the widow's windows." "Too interested," Purbright repeated gently. "Flaxborough seldom forgives a lingering glance. There's more. He was apparently hanging about the parish hall corridor yesterday morning as well, before the sewing circle started. Mrs. Dowsett says she heard shuffling." Purbright suppressed a smile. Shuffling is not yet a crime. No, sir, but combined with the corridor and the hedge and the widow fainting twice in one day. Chubb hesitated, then added with cautious enthusiasm, Town Council is very keen for us to look into him. They think it might all fit neatly, something to do with inheritance anxieties. Inheritance, Purbright murmured. How comforting for them. He stood, brushed an imaginary speck from his sleeve, and collected his hat. Very well, let us speak to young Martin. Chubb brightened, though Purbright suspected the sergeant expected a much tidier conclusion than the inspector ever accepted so early. The Bletchley residence, Martin's rather than Serena's, lay on the far edge of town in a cul-de-sac of modest houses whose gardens reflected the temperament of their occupants. Martin's garden was tidy but erratic, clipped hedges but with inexplicable gaps, flowers planted in rows that curved for no reason. The path to the door bore the faint, restless scratches left by someone who liked to pace. Chubb knocked firmly. After some rustling, shuffling, of the incriminating kind, no doubt, and a thump that suggested a toppled object, the door opened a cautious 4 inches. Martin Bletchley regarded them with the wide, startled eyes of a man confronted by an unexpected delivery of doom. "Inspector Pubright?" he whispered, as though saying the name too loudly might invoke further calamity. "Good morning, Mr. Bletchley," Purbright said in a tone designed to encourage rather than frighten. "May we come in?" Martin blinked twice and opened the door fully, revealing a small, cluttered sitting room that bore the hallmarks of someone who collected objects not because he wanted them, but because throwing anything away felt like a terrible risk. "Sorry about the mess," he muttered. "I meant to tidy, but things keep happening." Purbright stepped inside with polite restraint. Chubb, by contrast, scanned the room with the discreet eagerness of someone seeking a misplaced confession. "We'd like to ask you a few questions," Purbright said gently, "concerning your Aunt Serena." That did it. Martin's already taut posture tightened further, as though a string had been pulled inside him. "Is she unwell? Did she faint again? Someone said she fainted twice." His words spilled out with unfiltered worry. "She is resting," Purbright replied. "But there have been reports of you being near her cottage yesterday evening." Martin's face went crimson. Oh, that wasn't anything sinister. I wasn't spying or anything, I swear. I was checking on her." "Checking?" Purbright prompted. "She hasn't been herself. She hardly eats. She walks at night. And 2 days ago she posted a letter without a stamp, which isn't like her at all. I only wanted to see if she needed anything." "From the hedge?" Chubb asked with suspicion. Martin winced. "I didn't want her to think I was hovering. She hates fuss. Always has." Purbright regarded him quietly for a moment. The young man's nervousness felt genuine. Too genuine, in fact, for the neat sort of malice the council hoped for. "And the corridor at St. Luke's yesterday morning?" Purbright asked. Martin hesitated, eyes flicking between them. "I was looking for her after the service ended. I hoped she might want to walk home with someone, but the women there can be intense." He swallowed. "I didn't want them to see me. They'd all talk." Purbright's expression softened a degree. It was difficult not to pity the young man whose life seemed shaped by embarrassment more than intention. "There is one other matter," Purbright said. "Mr. Felpish." Martin's reaction was instantaneous. His shoulders dropped, his face drained of colour. "Edgar," he whispered. "Oh." Purbright waited. "I knew him," Martin said finally. "A little. Not well. But he was, kind, in a way other men weren't. People said he kept to himself because he was odd. He wasn't odd." just quiet. "And your aunt's connection to him?" Purbright asked. Martin hesitated again, that inner string tightening. She told everyone she barely knew him. He swallowed. "But I don't think that was true." "Why?" "Well, 5 years ago after he died, Aunt Serena had a box she didn't want anyone to see. She buried it in the back garden. I only know because she thought I was out. When I asked her later why she was upset, she said it was household things. But she looked frightened." Purbright felt the faint tug of significance. "Do you know what was in it?" Martin shook his head. "She never spoke of it again." He stood then, clasping his hands in a gesture of defense and apology. "Inspector, I would never hurt her. I've only ever wanted to help. She's all the family I've got. If she's in trouble, I want to know, but I'm afraid she won't tell me anything." Purbright exchanged a brief glance with Chubb, who seemed deflated at the lack of villainy on display. "Thank you, Mr. Bletchley," Purbright said, rising. "You've been very helpful." Martin followed them to the door, wringing his hands. "Please, if you learn anything that might help her, you'll tell me, won't you?" Purbright offered a reassuring nod. "You have my word." Back on the path, Chubb exhaled with disappointment. "He's nervous enough to be guilty." "And yet," Purbright said, "his nerves run in the wrong direction. A guilty man usually fears discovery. Martin Bletchley fears misunderstanding." Chubb frowned. "Then who's left?" Purbright looked toward the faint outline of the parish spire through the morning mist. "Everyone, Sergeant, until they are not." Martin Bletchley might have been the easy suspect the town craved, but Purbright had already dismissed the notion. There was something older and quieter beneath Serena's whispered warning, something that did not fit in the neat box the council longed for. As they walked away, Purbright felt the threads of the mystery pulling not toward the timid nephew but back toward the widow herself, and the shadow of a man, long dead, whose name still unsettled the living. Purbright left the Bletchley cul-de-sac with the quiet certainty that Martin's involvement was, at worst, peripheral, and at best the result of a nervous disposition misinterpreted by neighbours eager for drama. But dismissing a tidy suspect had consequences. It meant acknowledging that the disturbance had deeper roots, ones that stretched beyond a nephew's anxious hovering. And when mysteries stretched deeper in Flaxborough, they usually did so beneath something apparently harmless, a cupboard, a drawer, a garden, or, more often than not, the parish hall. It was there Purbright went next, arriving shortly after the midday chimes from St. Luke's Tower. The hall was empty, save for Mrs. Malden, who was energetically sweeping the floor in the manner of someone attempting to remove not just dust, but memories. She looked up as the inspector stepped inside, her expression hovering between flattery and alarm. "Oh, Inspector Pubright," she said, lowering her broom as though sweeping were a suspicious activity. "You've come about the incident, I suppose." "The incident," Purbright echoed gently, "or more precisely, its surroundings." Mrs. Malden brightened. "I can tell you everything. I noticed Serena was pale even before she fainted, though I didn't want to say anything. Some women don't like being told how they look." "Quite," Purbright agreed. "I don't need the scene described again, but I would like to look through the things Mrs. Bletchley brought with her yesterday. She left her sewing bag behind." Mrs. Malden nodded and retrieved a modest, faded floral bag from the table near the window. "I didn't open it," she assured him, though her tone suggested she wouldn't have admitted it even if she had rummaged through every stitch. Purbright thanked her and carried the bag to a nearby chair. He opened it slowly, as though expecting it to resist. It didn't. Inside lay the usual assortment of domestic items, a half-finished hem, a pincushion flattened by age, a spool of grey thread, a pair of spectacles, and a small folded cloth that, when opened, revealed nothing more mysterious than 2 neatly wrapped barley sugars. Then Purbright noticed something incongruous tucked against the side of the bag, an object whose appearance felt too sharply distinct from the soft domestic clutter surrounding it. A folded railway timetable. He lifted it carefully. It was old, the paper worn soft along the creases. Across the front, faint but visible, were the words Midland Line, Lincolnshire Division, Spring and Summer Schedule. The year printed beneath was the one that had claimed Edgar Felpish. Purbright unfolded the timetable with the deliberation of a man accustomed to discovering small truths in unassuming places. From between its yellowed pages slipped a scrap of paper, or rather a corner of a photograph, jagged where it had been torn. The fragment showed a sliver of a hand, a cuff, and the faint impression of a second figure standing beside the first, though too little remained to know who either had been. Mrs. Maldon, sweeping nearer, ventured, "Is it important, Inspector?" "That it remains to be seen," Purbright said, though privately he knew that it almost certainly was. Widows rarely carried 5-year-old railway timetables in their sewing bags unless they had a reason, and reasons in Flaxborough were seldom dull. He examined the timetable more closely. A faint pencil mark circled a particular date, one that matched the day Edgar Felpish had reportedly drowned. No other markings appeared, but one was enough. "Was anyone sitting near Mrs. Bletchley yesterday?" he asked. "Mrs. Wivton and Mrs. Dowsett," Mrs. Maldon replied immediately. "They always arrive early to ensure they sit together. It prevents disputes." "Disputes?" "Oh, over who gets the kettle first, mostly." She glanced at the timetable. "Do you think Serena was planning to travel somewhere?" Purbright folded the timetable carefully. "Possibly. Or she might have been remembering something." "Well, she certainly remembered something now," Mrs. Maldon said, with the grave relish of someone who had fully embraced the excitement. Talking in her sleep like that? Poor thing. Purbright thanked her again, returned the items to the bag, and left the hall with the timetable tucked safely into his coat. Outside the air was cool and smelled faintly of wet stone, the kind of day that made old stories seem more alive than they were. He had barely reached the church gate when he encountered Mrs. Wivton, striding purposefully along the path, her umbrella clutched under her arm like a baton of authority. "Inspector, just the man I hoped to find," she announced. Purbright inclined his head. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wivton." "I've remembered something," she declared, lowering her voice to the confidential register used for gossip, deemed too important for ordinary pitch. "Something about Serena and Edgar Felpish." Purbright waited politely. "It was just a few weeks before he died," she continued. "I saw them talking behind the churchyard wall. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Serena was always proper. But the way Edgar bent toward her, well," she pursed her lips. "It wasn't quite right." "And you didn't mention this yesterday?" "I didn't want to make assumptions," she said, which, coming from Mrs. Wivton, was rather like a fish claiming it avoided water. "But with all this business happening, I thought it best to tell you." "Very thoughtful," Purbright murmured. Mrs. Wivton leaned closer. "Do you suppose Edgar has returned? People are saying it. Mrs. Dowsett insists she dreamt of him just last night." "Dreams are rarely reliable witnesses," Purbright replied. "Though thank you for sharing what you remembered." She sailed off with the air of someone who had performed a significant public service. After she left, Purbright walked slowly toward Candlewick Lane again, not to disturb Serena, but to consider the house from a distance. Her curtains were drawn. The faint silhouette behind them was still and low, suggesting she remained seated or resting. He wondered if she had placed the timetable in her sewing bag deliberately or in haste, and why she had torn a photograph rather than simply removing it whole. Most intriguing of all was the date circled on the timetable, as though Serena had marked it during the time Edgar was alive, or perhaps much later, when she could bear to revisit it. The truth of it tugged at him like a loose thread, urging him onward. A sound to his right made him turn. Mrs. Dowsett emerged from behind a hedge so abruptly that Purbright suspected she had been crouching there for some time. "Oh, Inspector," she said, feigning surprise. "Didn't see you there." "A common difficulty," Purbright replied pleasantly. "I was just checking on Serena," Mrs. Dowsett said, "being neighbourly." "From behind the hedge?" She coloured slightly. "Well, one doesn't want to intrude." Purbright let the remark drift away without pursuit. "Mrs. Dowsett, did Serena receive any letters recently? Something that might have upset her?" Mrs. Dowsett hesitated. "I did see her pick up an envelope yesterday morning. Plain, no stamp. She tucked it straight into her coat." "Did she seem startled?" "Not startled," Mrs. Dowsett said slowly. "More resigned." That was interesting. Resignation was a rare reaction to anonymous correspondence, unless one expected it. Purbright thanked her and left, allowing the misty breeze to clear the remnants of conversation. His steps carried him toward the station, but his mind remained fixed on the sewing bag, the railway timetable, the torn photograph, and the quiet, heavy look on Serena Bletchley's face. Something had been revived in Flaxborough, not Edgar Felpish himself, but the unresolved truth of his death. A truth Serena might have tried to bury, much like the mysterious box Martin had mentioned. And if the truth had stirred itself now, it was unlikely to settle again without guidance. Purbright adjusted his hat, feeling the case unfolding in directions that promised complexity and perhaps danger, but also the slow, inevitable clarity that came when the right detail was found at the right moment. He had just found one, possibly two. The rest would follow. They always did. Purbright returned to the station with the railway timetable folded neatly in his pocket, the torn photograph corner resting inside it like a splinter of someone else's memory. He placed both items on his desk with the care of a man arranging pieces of a puzzle still too faint to distinguish, then sat back, steepling his fingers. Martin Bletchley's nervous explanations had filled some gaps, but they had also created new ones. The timetable, the circled date, the torn photograph, these were not the behaviours of a woman disconnected from the past. They were the relics of someone still tethered to it. Sergeant Chubb entered with a cup of tea, set it down, and glanced at the items on the desk with a curiosity he did not attempt to hide. "Find anything interesting, sir?" "Only what Serena chose to carry with her yesterday," Purbright said, "which is to say, something she wished not to leave behind." Chubb frowned at the timetable. "Old railway schedules aren't exactly keepsakes unless she collected them." "No sign she ever did," Purbright murmured. "And the year is too telling." He closed the timetable gently. "We need a broader view, Sergeant. Something beyond the gossip and the nephew. I want the doctor's notes on Edgar Felpish's death, and I would appreciate a word with Dr. Broughton himself." Chubb's eyebrows rose. "You think there's something wrong with the certificate?" "I don't presume anything," Purbright replied with his customary calm. "But death, like everything else, benefits from clarity." Chubb left to make arrangements, and Purbright rose, deciding that clarity was most easily found by speaking to those who had long believed they possessed it, the townspeople who saw everything through the lens of their own miniature histories. He began with Mrs. Lummidge, whose house on Candlewick Lane was conveniently positioned between Serena Bletchley's cottage and the rest of the world. She answered the door with the expression of someone who had been prepared to open it for quite some time. "Oh, Inspector, I thought you might come back," she said, ushering him, without invitation, into a parlour cluttered with lace doilies and bric-a-brac. "Serena's resting again, poor dear. I expect she hasn't slept properly in days." "I dare say she hasn't," Purbright agreed. "Mrs. Lummidge, you mentioned yesterday that Serena received an unstamped envelope. Would you happen to recall whether she received any others recently?" The woman hesitated, trying to locate the boundary between gossip and confession. "Well, now you mention it, I did see one other envelope under her mat about a month ago. Thick paper, handwritten. She picked it up so quickly I hardly caught sight of it." "Did she react?" "Oh, yes. She froze a moment, like someone remembering a warning. Then she tucked it in her coat and hurried inside. Anything about her expression you recall? Surprise, fear, recognition?" "A bit of all three, I think." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "Did she tell anyone about it?" "Not that she told me," Mrs. Lummidge said, with an expression that implied she should have. He thanked her and left before she could retrieve additional recollections of questionable accuracy. Next, he paid a visit to Harold Scholes, the retired railway ticket inspector who lived above the old station cafe. Scholes had the leathery skin of a man permanently wind-chafed by years of standing on exposed platforms. His eyes, however, remained sharp, too sharp, in fact, for a man claiming peaceful retirement. "Inspector Pubright," he greeted, leaning heavily on the rail of his narrow stairwell. "Come to ask about railway matters, have you?" "If you're not averse to discussing them," Purbright replied. "Not at all," keeps the mind alive, thinking back on old timetables and train folk. "A railway man never truly retires, you know." Purbright smiled politely. "I understand you worked during the year Edgar Felpish died." "I did indeed. Now that was a strange business," Scholes said, lowering himself into a chair with creaking satisfaction. "Everyone in town believed he drowned, but not everyone knew where he'd been that morning." "And where was that?" "On my platform," Scholes said, tapping his cane for emphasis. "He bought a ticket for the 9:40 to Saxford. I stamped it myself." Quiet fellow, though he seemed anxious, kept looking over his shoulder. "Did he board the train?" "Oh, yes. I watched him step on, and that's the last I saw of him." Purbright paused. "So his presence at the lock later that day—" "Didn't fit? No," Scholes said, nodding vigorously. "But folks put oddities out of their minds when there's a funeral and a body. Didn't want to trouble themselves with contradictions." "And did you mention it to anyone at the time?" "Dr. Broughton," Scholes replied. "He told me not to stir things, said grief was hard enough on Serena." Purbright's gaze narrowed almost imperceptibly. "You spoke to Dr. Broughton before the inquest?" "Morning after the body was found," Scholes said, "but he seemed uneasy. Told me best to let matters lie." Purbright left Scholes with a polite farewell, though inwardly he felt the threads tugging harder. Dr. Broughton's reluctance to entertain conflicting evidence, Serena's hidden correspondence, the torn photograph, it was all gathering weight. He found Dr. Broughton at the surgery, writing notes with the outer calm of a man determined not to betray his inner state. He looked up when Purbright entered, his smile polite but strained. "Inspector, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'd like to discuss Edgar Felpish." Dr. Broughton's pen paused mid-stroke. "That's an old case, and yet it may still have relevance," Purbright said. "Mr. Scholes informs me Edgar bought a railway ticket the morning of his death." "I recall Scholes mentioning something of the sort," the doctor said carefully. "But Edgar did have a tendency to wander. His body was found. I saw it myself." "You Identified the body? I wrote the certificate, Broughton admitted, adjusting his spectacles. The features were difficult to distinguish given the condition, but the clothing matched. Purbright let the silence stretch long enough for the doctor to shift uneasily. There are some, Broughton ventured, who cling to odd theories because death unsettles them. Grief needs certainty. And medical certainty is sometimes built on assumptions, Purbright replied mildly. Broughton cleared his throat. Are you suggesting I erred? I suggest only that a 5-year-old tragedy has begun to stir again, Purbright said. And Serena Bletchley appears caught in its wake. The doctor leaned back, rubbing his forehead. Serena? Yes, she has always been fragile. She had some difficulty with Edgar before his death. Nothing improper, just old. Disagreements. Disagreements? Broughton hesitated. I shouldn't speak about private consultations. Purbright rose. Then perhaps I should speak with Serena again. She might be more prepared to share now. He left the surgery with the distinct impression that the doctor knew far more than he wished to admit. By late afternoon, Purbright found himself once more near Candlewick Lane. The mist had thinned, but a hush hung over the street, as though the houses themselves were listening. Serena's cottage appeared quiet. No twitch of lace curtain, no glimpse of her slight silhouette. But Purbright did not knock. Not yet. He needed more pieces first. As he walked back toward the high street, he reflected on the cast widening around Edgar Felpish. People who had known him, perhaps feared him, perhaps mourned him improperly. Mrs. Lummidge with her secrets of others, Scholes with his overlooked ticket, Broughton with his evasions, and Serena with her torn photograph and her whispered warning. Each had a connection, but only one had spoken Edgar's name in her sleep with such unmistakable dread. The truth was stretching now, pushing free of the polite soil Flaxborough had packed over it. It would not take much more to bring it fully into the light. The next morning broke pale and unsettled, a wet light creeping across Flaxborough, as though reluctant to examine the town too closely. Purbright arrived early at the station, intending to review the fragmented pieces collected so far. But before he could so much as remove his coat, Constable Malley burst in with the clumsy urgency of a man propelled more by shock than by discipline. "Inspector, sir, you'd best come. It's Mrs. Bletchley again." Purbright's expression didn't change, but something in his posture tightened. "What has happened?" "She's been found on the floor of her cottage, conscious but shaken, claims someone was outside whispering Edgar Felpish's name into her garden." Purbright paused only long enough to retrieve his hat. "Where is she now?" "With Dr. Broughton," Malley said, already stepping backward toward the door. "Says she's frightened out of her wits." Purbright followed him out into the grey morning, the mist clinging to the air like breath held too long. Candlewick Lane, usually placid in its routine of curtains twitching and doorsteps being swept, now thrummed with the cautious energy of neighbours pretending not to stare. Serena's cottage was at the centre of it all, its gate left slightly ajar, a detail that struck Purbright as more telling than dramatic. Malley led him inside, where Dr. Broughton stood over Serena with an air of professional concern tinged by something more evasive. Serena herself sat hunched in a chair, wrapped in a blanket as though warmth alone might restore her. Her eyes, usually soft with restrained grief, now held the sharp brightness of someone who had met fear at close quarters. Purbright approached slowly. "Mrs. Bletchley," he said gently, "I'm glad to see you awake." She attempted a nod, though it carried only half its intention. "Inspector, someone was outside, I heard them, whispering through the hedge, whispering his name." Purbright sat across from her, hands folded calmly. Tell me exactly what happened." She closed her eyes as though retrieving the memory was exhausting. "I woke before dawn. Just a feeling, something pulling me out of sleep. I thought perhaps it was a dream, but then I heard a voice, a man's voice, soft, almost coaxing, saying Edgar, Edgar Felpish. Slow, like someone repeating a password. And you are certain it was outside? Not inside the house?" Purbright asked. She flinched. "Yes." Dr. Broughton cleared his throat. "She was found by Mrs. Lummidge, who claimed she saw no one leaving the property." Purbright resisted the urge to smile. Mrs. Lummidge's claim of seeing no one was about as trustworthy as her claims of seeing everyone. "I fell," Serena continued, gripping the blanket. "My legs gave way. I must have hit the table. When I woke, someone was knocking, Mrs. Lummidge asking if I was all right." Mally shifted awkwardly. "Inspector." "Mrs. Lummidge also found something by the gate." Purbright looked up. "Something?" Broughton reached into his medical bag and produced a transparent evidence envelope. Inside lay a single glove, a gentleman's glove, dark leather, elegant, and very much out of fashion. Purbright studied it. The stitching was unusually fine. The cuff bore a faint embossed mark, a manufacturer that had closed decades ago. The glove looked almost untouched by time, as though worn once, carefully kept, and then dropped with deliberate intention. "Where exactly was this found?" Purbright asked. "By the gate," Mally replied. "Right by the latch." Serena shivered. "It isn't Edgar's," she whispered, as though afraid the denial itself might summon him. "Edgar never owned gloves like that. He wasn't that sort of man. She faltered. "He didn't have much." "You recognize it at all?" Purbright asked carefully. "No." Broughton interjected with a diplomatic murmur. "I recommend rest. She's still shaken." Purbright stood. "Of course. Mrs. Bletchley, if you recall anything, the tone of the voice, the footstep, anything, you must tell me." Her eyes, clouded with memory and dread, met his. "Inspector, why now, after all these years? Why would someone say his name outside my house?" Purbright didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he placed a reassuring hand on the back of her chair and stepped into the hallway, Mally trailing after him with the anxious hope that the inspector might already be closing in on a suspect. Outside, the mist thickened as though guarding the cottage. Purbright paused near the gate, crouching slightly to inspect the gravelled path. The stones showed faint depressions, but nothing definitive. Whoever had stood there had done so lightly. But something else caught his eye. A small, almost invisible line carved into the wood of the gate. Not a natural crack, but a shallow indentation made by something edged. A knife, a key, or simply a nervous fidget from someone who lingered too long. He straightened slowly. "What do you make of the glove, sir?" Mally asked. "That it was meant to be found," Purbright said. "A message, not a mistake." "And the whispering?" "That too," Purbright replied. He walked a few paces down the lane, studying the angles of houses and hedges. Candlewick Lane formed a narrow corridor of intersecting sightlines. A person could stand unnoticed if they knew precisely where to place themselves. As Purbright observed the street, Mrs. Dowsett popped out from behind her garden wall with the uncanny timing of someone who had been waiting to be noticed. "Inspector," she called. "Terrible business, whispering at widows before dawn. The town isn't safe." Purbright gave a polite nod. "Were you awake at the time?" "Oh, quite," she said proudly. "I suffer from an overactive mind. It refuses to sleep when odd things are afoot." "A fortunate trait," Purbright said. "Did you see anyone in the lane?" "I saw a shape by Serena's gate," she said immediately. Tall, I think, or perhaps wrapped in something, hard to tell in that dreadful pre-dawn light. But I did hear a soft step, and then nothing. Did the shape move away on foot? Not that I heard, it simply vanished. Purbright thanked her, though he trusted the accuracy of her account only marginally more than her motives for offering it. By midday, word had spread again. The morning's whisper had already become, in the retellings of Flaxborough's residents, everything from a ghostly visitation to a man calling for his lost love. Through all this, Purbright remained strikingly calm, moving from the lane to the high street with the quiet tread of someone piecing together a scattered pattern. He visited the gate a second time that afternoon, once the crowds had dispersed. Kneeling, he examined the hinge. A faint smudge of dark residue marked the metal. Not soil, but something smoother, leather perhaps, or oil. He stood, turning the glove envelope over, slowly. The glove's pristine condition interested him as much as its age. A man carrying such a glove carried it with intention. A man dropping one did so with purpose. It was not merely a relic, it was a signature. Later, in the station, Chubb approached him briskly. "Sir, we've checked old records. That gloves maker shut down 30 years ago. Expensive shop, London-based, only bespoke orders." "Bespoke," Purbright repeated quietly. "So whoever owned these gloves valued precision." "And fashion," Chubb added. "Not necessarily," Purbright murmured. "Sometimes a glove is all simply a reminder," Chubb frowned. "Of what?" "Of who someone used to be." The day closed with no resolution, but with a deepening certainty. Someone was circling Serena Bletchley, someone who wanted Edgar Felpish resurrected as a presence, not as a man, someone who understood how fear works in small towns, and someone who had begun a game 5 years ago, only now deciding to continue it. Purbright sat alone in his office as evening fell, the glove lying beside him on the desk like an accusation. Whoever whispered Edgar Felpish's name had not come to mourn. They had come to remind. Evening settled upon Flaxborough in its usual modest fashion, dimming windows one by one as though the town were being gently folded into sleep. But in his office at the station, Inspector Pubright sat long past the hour when respectable people surrendered themselves to night. The glove lay on his desk like a punctuation mark, silent, elegant, and unnervingly deliberate. The timetable rested beneath it, corners slightly curled, its circled date like an old wound reopened. Purbright leaned back, hands laced across his stomach, and let his thoughts drift, not in leaps but in the patient, measured currents that seemed natural to him. In his years in Flaxborough, he had come to understand that the truth rarely emerged in the bright, forthright manner people claimed to admire. It slipped instead through the cracks, through hesitation, evasion, the tremor of a tone, the inconsistency of a habit. Great lies were uncommon. Small lies, however, accumulated like dust. One hardly noticed them until they began to shape the contours of a mystery. And something about Edgar Felpish's death had always carried the scent of small lies. A drowning that no one quite witnessed. A body identified not by face, but by clothing. A railway ticket bought, but never accounted for. A widow who had claimed to barely know the man, but now carried relics tied unmistakably to him. Purbright knew such contradictions were rarely random. They were the sediments left behind when truth had been buried under haste or fear. He rose, walked to the window, and looked out across the dim courtyard toward the station gates. The lamps cast pale arcs on the cobblestones, illuminating nothing unusual, yet everything felt subtly expectant, as though the case itself were watching. He returned to his desk and opened the torn photograph corner again. It was too small to identify anyone, yet the cuff and sliver of arm suggested a man used to formal dress, a contrast to the modest income Edgar Felpish was believed to have lived on. Had Serena torn the photograph in anger or desperation, or had someone torn it for her? These questions circled him until fatigue tugged gently at his thoughts. He switched off the lamp and left the station, the darkness outside crisp and faintly scented with the first promise of frost. On his walk home, he passed the quiet row of cottages on Candlewick Lane. Serena's house was dark now, the curtains drawn, no silhouette visible behind them. But the lane itself felt changed, not quite tainted. Flaxborough never allowed anything so dramatic, but marked as though it had absorbed the whisper spoken there. Purbright paused at the gate where the glove had been found. He bent slightly, examining the ground once more. The smudged trace of leather on metal, the faint indentation in the gravel. They still suggested nothing so crude as a hurried struggle. Instead, they carried a suggestion of careful placement, as though the visitor had been confident enough not to rush. A man revisiting a memory, perhaps, or reliving one. As he straightened, an upstairs window across the lane flickered with movement, Mrs. Lummidge, no doubt, sweeping aside a curtain in the hope of catching him in an interesting posture. He lifted a hand politely, though she vanished with suspicious speed. Such people, Purbright mused, rarely lied with intention. Their falsehoods came from the pleasure of involvement, not malice, but in a matter such as this, even innocent distortions could cloud the truth. Back at his small flat above the post office, Purbright made tea and allowed the warmth to settle him. He sat near the window, staring at nothing in particular while his thoughts threaded themselves into order. The town had begun constructing its own explanations, a haunting, an omen, perhaps even Edgar's return. Flaxborough loved superstition nearly as much as it loved propriety. But Purbright trusted neither superstition nor propriety. He trusted patterns. And a pattern was emerging. Serena had received anonymous letters. She carried a torn photograph. She kept an old timetable marked with the date of Edgar's supposed drowning. She fainted in public at the mention of his name, and now someone whispered that name from her hedge before dawn. Either the past had returned in a literal sense, which Purbright dismissed, or someone was trying to force it back into her life. He finished his tea, placed the cup aside, and let his mind settle like dust in a quiet room. Human nature, he reflected, was rarely violent, but it was often cowardly. People sought to hide embarrassing connections or inconvenient truths. They forgot that in a small town, nothing stayed forgotten. It simply lingered like perfume on fabric, waiting for the right warmth to release its scent again. The next morning, he returned to the station early, discovering Chubb already there, sorting papers with an expression suggesting he wasn't certain where each belonged, but felt committed to placing them somewhere. "Morning, sir," Chubb said. "Didn't sleep much?" "Had enough," Purbright replied. "Any word from the forensic lab about the glove?" "Nothing useful. They say it's clean, too clean actually, almost polished." "Polished gloves are rarely accidental," Purbright said. Chubb nodded. And Scholes came by, says he thought of another detail. Edgar wasn't alone at the station the day he bought that ticket. Purbright turned. "Go on." "He says a gentleman was watching him. Not someone he recognized. Tall, well-dressed, the sort who looks like he's too busy to be where he is." Purbright absorbed this silently. A second figure, a watcher, someone who cared where Edgar went. And he never mentioned this before. Says he forgot, or didn't think it mattered. "Small lies," Purbright murmured. Chubb blinked. "Sir?" "Nothing." Purbright walked to his desk and sat, placing the timetable and glove before him once more. The circle around the date felt suddenly heavier, as if it were a knot tightening in the cord between past and present. Someone had been watching Edgar Felpish the day he died. Someone who may now be watching Serena. He reached for his coat. "Going out again?" Chubb asked. "Yes," Purbright said. "I believe it's time to revisit the edges." "The edges of what?" "The truth," Purbright said simply, buttoning his coat. "And the people who've spent 5 years trying not to disturb it." He left the station and walked toward the high street, moving at the unhurried pace that allowed details to present themselves naturally. He wasn't heading anywhere specific yet. He only knew that the town was beginning to shift, the way it always did when secrets grew tired of confinement. And as he walked, he considered the most telling feature of small lies: they often clung to the person least capable of keeping them. Serena Bletchley had carried her burden quietly for years, but someone else, someone who had preserved a pair of bespoke gloves, someone who whispered at dawn and left no footprints, was beginning to stir. Whoever they were not lying by accident. They were lying with purpose. Purbright moved through the morning with the calm deliberation of a man threading a needle in dim light. After the whispering incident, the sense of something pressing forward, slow but inevitable, had grown unmistakable. The town simmered with quiet speculation. Even the pigeons on the high street roofs seemed to regard passers-by with suspiciously knowing tilts of the head. But Purbright did not allow himself to be rushed. He trusted timing the way a gardener trusted weather. One could not force a flower before it wished to bloom. His goal today was not to confront, but to observe, and to observe in such a way that those being observed would not realize they were doing the revealing. He waited until late morning before making his way to St. Luke's Parish Hall again, choosing a time when he expected at least some familiar figures to be circulating within. As he approached, he saw Mrs. Malden airing out curtains, the vicar's wife conferring with someone inside, and, most importantly, Dr. Broughton arriving from the opposite direction, his gait brisk but lacking its usual composure. Purbright timed his steps carefully. "Morning, Doctor," he called in a tone pleasant enough to ease any man into conversation. Broughton visibly startled. "Inspector, good morning. I didn't expect to see you here." "Few people ever do," Purbright replied mildly. "I thought it might be useful to speak with some of the ladies who were present during Mrs. Bletchley's fainting spell." Broughton gave a brittle nod. "Quite. They do tend to witness things." They entered together. Mrs. Wivton and Mrs. Dowsett, who had been rearranging chairs in a manner that suggested an argument about proper alignment, stopped mid-fuss when they saw Purbright. "Inspector," Mrs. Dowsett exclaimed, "how fortunate. We were just discussing the strange circumstances of Serena's troubles." "Indeed," Purbright said. "And what conclusions have you arrived at?" Mrs. Wivton inhaled deeply, ready to deliver something suitably dramatic, but Purbright gently cut her off with a raised hand. "Before you share theories, I wonder if you all might help me replicate something." Broughton stiffened. "Replicate what?" "The seating arrangement from the morning Serena fainted," Purbright said, gesturing at the tables. "I find that surroundings often jog memories." He said this lightly, knowing full well that each woman in the room would interpret it as an invitation to display superior recall. Within a minute, chairs had been dragged into positions that bore varying degrees of resemblance to the original layout. Mrs. Malden fluttered about with a broom as if authenticity depended on dust levels. Broughton hovered near the wall, arms folded too tightly. Purbright stepped into the midst of the bustle like a conductor readying an orchestra. When Mrs. Bletchley murmured Edgar Felpish's name, he asked, turning to Mrs. Wiveton, "Where exactly were you seated?" "Here," she said, planting herself firmly in a chair beside the window. "And Mrs. Dowsett was there." "And Dr. Broughton?" Purbright asked casually. The doctor blinked. "I was not present." "No," Purbright agreed softly, "but you arrived shortly afterward." Broughton made a show of nodding. "Yes, when Mrs. Malden called for assistance." Purbright watched him carefully. The doctor seemed intent on appearing calm, but his eyes darted toward the door every few seconds, as though rehearsing an escape. "And where," Purbright said, "was Serena's sewing bag at the time?" Mrs. Malden pointed. "Right there on the floor beside her chair, same as always." "And did anyone handle the bag after Serena fainted?" "No one touched it but me," Mrs. Malden declared proudly. "I gathered her things." "And Dr. Broughton?" Purbright's tone remained gentle. Broughton's shoulders tightened. "I examined her, yes, but I did not rummage through her belongings." "Of course," Purbright murmured. "I only ask because her sewing bag contained an old railway timetable. I wondered whether any of you recall seeing her take it out." The room's atmosphere shifted. An unexpected stillness settled over the women. Mrs. Dowsett frowned. Mrs. Wiveton leaned forward, hungry. Mrs. Malden blinked rapidly. "No," Mrs. Dowsett said slowly. "She never does. Serena is very particular. She keeps only sewing things in her bag." Purbright nodded. "So the timetable must have been placed there earlier." "Yes," Mrs. Wiveton said decisively, "if indeed she put it there herself." Her readiness to insinuate delighted her so much that Purbright did not need to remark upon it. He turned slightly, now facing Harold Scholes, who had entered unnoticed through the back door, likely drawn by the irresistible prospect of a gathering. Scholes tipped his hat nervously. "Inspector," he said, "I didn't mean to intrude." "Quite all right," Purbright replied. "In fact, your timing is helpful." Broughton's expression tightened again. "Mr. Scholes," Purbright continued, "you mentioned a second figure on the platform the day Edgar Felpish purchased his ticket. Would you be able to describe him again?" Slowly. Scholes shifted. "Tall, well-dressed, gloves, that much I recall." Broughton exhaled in a sharp, unintended hiss. Purbright's gaze flicked toward him, not accusatory, merely observant, but the doctor paled slightly. In the corner of the room, Mrs. Wiveton's eyes widened with carnivorous interest. "I don't suppose," Purbright said, "this gentleman on the platform might have been someone from town?" Scholes hesitated, reluctant to commit. "Hard to say. Didn't look familiar." "But he looked," Purbright prompted softly, "like someone trying not to be familiar." Broughton dropped his pen. It hit the floor with a crisp, unnatural severity. Everyone turned. The doctor recovered the pen with too much haste, brushing invisible dust from it. His voice trembled with impatience. "Inspector, are we here to discuss ancient railway platforms or the matter of Serena's distress?" "Both," Purbright said gently. "Old matters often inform new ones." Broughton's jaw tightened. "I really must return to my patients." "Of course," Purbright said pleasantly, stepping aside. "You wouldn't mind if I visit your surgery later today, would you? There are a few details from the Felpish certificate I'd like clarified." The doctor blinked, then attempted a smile that sat poorly on his face. "If you feel it necessary." "Oh, I do." Broughton left hurriedly, faster than propriety demanded. Mrs. Wiveton watched him go with the fascination of a cat observing erratic prey. Purbright did not comment on the reaction. Instead, he turned to the group with a mild, reassuring smile. "Thank you all. This helps clarify matters." The ladies straightened with pride as though they had contributed to a vital national investigation rather than a quiet domestic puzzle. When Purbright exited the hall, the cool air felt like a page turning. He paused on the steps, hands in his pockets, studying the lane that stretched before him. His gentle trap had yielded something. Not a confession, not yet, but a reaction. Broughton had flinched at the mention of gloves, and at the railway platform, and at the timetable. Small tells, perhaps, but meaningful. Purbright began walking toward the high street, letting his thoughts flow in quiet, deliberate lines. He had not yet accused the doctor of anything. He had merely arranged the people, the conversations, the timing, so that the doctor accused himself. Not aloud, of course, but Purbright had learned long ago that guilt rarely announces itself. It emerges in glances, in hesitations, in the slight tightening of fingers around a pen, and today Dr. Broughton had spoken more through what he did not say than through anything he uttered. Purbright felt the case loosen another knot. Whoever whispered Edgar Felpish's name was drawing closer to Serena, but the person who reacted today had already been close once before. Purbright left the parish hall with the unhurried gait of a man strolling through mild weather, though his thoughts moved with far greater precision. Dr. Broughton's reactions, those small cracks in an otherwise controlled facade, had confirmed what instinct had already whispered. Someone was navigating this matter with practiced caution, and the doctor's unease suggested knowledge he had not shared. Perhaps not guilt, but certainly proximity, the glove, the railway timetable, the torn photograph. Each hinted at a story long in the making. And if a story had been left unfinished 5 years ago, someone was now determined to complete it, even if they had to coax Serena Bletchley toward the edge of old fears to do so. Purbright made his way through the high street, letting the familiar rhythms of the town accompany his thinking. Shops opened and closed with predictable clatter. Bicycles rattled over cobblestones. The butcher waved his cleaver at someone he disliked, though with enough cheer to avoid alarm. Nothing in Flaxborough ever appeared dramatic, not even when it very much was. He passed Bellamy's bookshop and paused. The proprietor stood in the doorway flipping through an old catalogue, the bell above the door quivering as though deciding whether to ring. "Morning, Inspector," Bellamy said without looking up. "You appear thoughtful." "It's a habit," Purbright replied. "Tell me, Mr. Bellamy, if one wished to find old railway timetables besides asking you, where else might one look?" Bellamy closed the catalogue with a soft thump. "Well, collectors meet at the market hall the first Saturday of every month, but Serena Bletchley has never attended those gatherings. She came to me because she knew I kept archives." "And did she explain why she needed a timetable from that specific year?" "She did not," Bellamy said, adjusting his spectacles. But her hands trembled when she asked. "Not excitement. Something more. Braced." Purbright nodded. "You mentioned she bought only one timetable." "Yes, though she stared at several. Her eyes lingered on the winter schedules before she settled on the spring one." "Strange," Purbright murmured, "considering Edgar died in autumn." Bellamy hesitated. "Inspector, if I may? I have heard Serena speak Edgar's name only once before." Purbright looked up. "Yes?" "It was years ago, soon after the funeral. She was in here searching for a particular devotional book. She whispered his name into the spine of a hymnal, as though apologizing to it." "Apologizing," Purbright repeated softly. Bellamy nodded. "It struck me. She looked burdened." Purbright thanked him and moved on, the word apologizing brushing through his thoughts with quiet insistence. People apologized to the dead for many reasons: grief, guilt, unfinished quarrels. But Serena had not appeared angry at Edgar. If anything, her fear now suggested the wound had never healed cleanly. Next, Purbright visited the records office adjoining the council building. It was an uninspired place, humid with old paper and civic complacency. Miss Harbottle, who guarded the archives with the ferocity of a librarian battling noisy children, peered at Purbright over her spectacles. "I need access to the inquest notes from the Phelpish case," Purbright told her. "Drowned, wasn't he?" she said, already turning toward the shelves. "Back in 18, body in dreadful condition. Records say identification made by clothing. Formal wear, as I recall." Purbright stilled. "Formal wear?" "Yes." Miss Harbottle retrieved a slim, brittle folder. "A dark coat with a tailored lining, white shirt, cufflinks, polished shoes. Rather fine if the notes are accurate." "That hardly fits Edgar's usual habits," Purbright said. "Doesn't it? I never knew him." "Nor did most people," Purbright said, accepting the folder. He scanned the pages. The description matched the memory of the man Scholes had seen at the station. Not Phelpish, but the stranger. Tall, well-dressed, gloves, someone accustomed to refinement. Had Edgar traded clothing with this man, or had someone mistaken the stranger for Edgar? Or, most troublingly, had someone arranged for a body to be misidentified? The inquest notes offered no contradiction, neither did they offer clarity. He left the building and stood a moment beneath its stone archway, letting the weight of the possibilities settle. A misidentified body could explain much, so could a staged drowning, but motive was the axis on which everything turned. Serena's secrets, Broughton's evasions, Scholes' memory of the Watcher, all threads but not yet tied. Purbright decided it was time to revisit the physical setting of Edgar Phelpish's last known movements. Not the river lock, too publicly accepted, too tidily explained, but the old railway siding beyond Flaxborough's main station, the one disused and overgrown, where the grass grew higher and the past lingered undisturbed. The siding lay 1/2 mile behind the station, reachable by a narrow track flanked by brambles. As Purbright stepped onto the gravel, the air shifted subtly, quieter, cooler, as though the place had been waiting. Rusted rails sat half-swallowed by earth. The remains of a hut stood leaning at an angle that suggested time had grown weary of holding it upright. And here, beneath the overhang of an elder tree, Purbright saw something that did not belong, a flattened patch of grass, too recently pressed to be natural. He knelt. The impression was shallow but distinct, a footprint, elongated by the slight slide of a boot heel on damp ground. Not large, not small, but careful. He looked closer. A second footprint overlapped the first at a different angle. Someone had stood here a while, shifting weight, watching. Several steps away, lodged between 2 stones, he found another glove, the matching pair. He held the second glove in his hand, the leather cold and rigid from the chill. It was not dropped by chance. Someone had left it here, quietly, as though acknowledging this place had meaning. Purbright turned the glove over. The stitching matched, the embossed mark matched, the intention matched. He slipped it into the evidence envelope beside its twin. The whisper at Serena's window had not been an isolated act. It was part of a pattern emerging like ink through paper. He stood, listening to the quiet as though expecting the past to speak. In the distance, the muted clang of the modern station drifted faintly, an unbroken line between what was and what had been lost. He walked further along the siding, boots crunching over the gravel. At the far end, where the rails disappeared into weeds, he found an old wooden bench, half rotted by weather. On it, lay another scrap of paper, this one larger than the photograph fragment in Serena's sewing bag. He lifted it. It appeared to be the other corner of the same photograph. Two figures, one unmistakably Serena Bletchley in younger years, the other a man with dark hair and a half-smile, wearing a coat finer than any Edgar Felpish had ever owned. Purbright exhaled slowly. Someone wanted this photograph found, in pieces, as breadcrumbs leading Serena, or him, back to the truth. He tucked the fragment safely away, then made his way back to town at a thoughtful pace. By the time he reached the high street, dusk crept along the shop fronts, casting faint orange light across cobbles. The world looked deceptively peaceful. Chubb intercepted him near the station entrance. "Sir, Dr. Broughton's been asking after you. Said he'd hoped to speak sooner." "Indeed," Purbright said. "Should I fetch him?" "No, I'll go to him shortly." Purbright paused, lowering his voice. "Before that, I need Martin." Bletchley brought to the station. "Quietly. And I need you to search Serena's garden, specifically the far right corner where her nephew says she buried something 5 years ago." Chubb nodded immediately. "A box?" "Perhaps." "And if we find it?" "Bring it to me, unopened." Chubb hesitated. "Sir, do you think Edgar Felpish is alive?" Purbright looked toward the fading sky. "I think someone wants us to believe something, and I think the truth lies neither in the river nor in the grave, but somewhere between them." He started toward the surgery, coat collar lifted against the chill, because whoever had torn the photograph, polished the gloves, whispered at dawn, and revisited the abandoned siding, was not finished. And Purbright suspected the next move would not be subtle. Purbright approached Dr. Broughton's surgery with the quiet certainty of a man stepping into a room whose furniture he already knew would be out of place. The building itself exhaled sterility, polished brass, clean windows, the faint medicinal scent drifting from an open vent. But beneath the surface lingered something else, something faintly sour, like old secrets that had been kept too long in an air-tight drawer. Broughton answered the door before Purbright could knock, as though he had been pacing behind it. "Inspector," he said, voice tight. "I'd hoped we could speak privately." "A sensible hope," Purbright replied. "Privacy encourages clarity." They entered the consultation room. It appeared tidy, but the doctor's unease had left subtle disturbances. A drawer half shut, a tray not quite centered, the blinds tilted at mismatched angles. Purbright noticed them all without comment. Broughton gestured awkwardly to a chair. "Please." Purbright remained standing. "You've been anxious since yesterday," he said gently. "A difficult state for a physician. What troubles you?" Broughton pressed his palms to his desk. "You've been stirring old cases, Inspector, bringing up Edgar Felpish as though he hadn't been buried properly." "Has he?" Purbright asked, his tone mild rather than accusatory. Broughton began to pace. He drowned. It happens. Flaxborough's river has taken more than one careless soul. "True," Purbright agreed, "but Edgar was not careless the morning he died. He bought a railway ticket he never used. Someone watched him at the station. And, interestingly, the man found in the river wore gloves and a fine coat Edgar never owned." Broughton stopped, back stiffening. "I told you, identification was difficult." "You wrote the certificate," Purbright reminded him. "Yet you never mentioned the discrepancy in clothing." "The body was badly damaged," Broughton said quickly. "We relied on context. Who else could it have been?" "A man with finer means," Purbright replied softly. "A man with bespoke gloves like these." He produced the evidence envelope. Containing the pair retrieved from the siding, the doctor recoiled as though from a live coal. "Where did you—" "Left for me," Purbright said. Or perhaps for Serena, or perhaps for both. Broughton grabbed the edge of the desk as if steadying himself. This is absurd. You are drawing wild inferences. Then allow me to be more precise, Purbright said, stepping closer, but keeping his voice low. 5 years ago, someone died wearing a gentleman's clothing. Someone of height and bearing unlike Edgar Felpish. Someone Serena recognized well enough to bury a photograph of. Broughton's breath hitched. And someone else, Purbright continued, told her to keep silent. Broughton's face drained of color. You think I think, Purbright said, that you knew much more than you dared to say at the inquest, and I think you feared that the truth, if spoken plainly, would collapse more than a medical report. The doctor sank heavily into a chair. His composure, so carefully arranged these years, crumpled like a paper folded one time too many. I thought it was Edgar, he whispered. But I wasn't sure. Serena insisted I confirm it. Purbright studied him. Serena insisted. Not because she believed it, I suspect, but because she feared what believing otherwise would do. Broughton rubbed his forehead. Edgar had a brother. Purbright's stillness deepened. I knew they looked alike, Broughton said. Henry Felpish, older by several years. They had a conflict, something about money. I never learned the details. Henry left town for London. Years passed. Then suddenly he returned, quietly. I saw him once at the surgery asking if Edgar could spare a small loan. Edgar refused. Henry was the man at the station, Purbright said. Possibly. And the body in the river? Broughton closed his eyes. I thought it was Edgar. Serena said it was Edgar. She was distraught. The clothes seemed too fine, but grief makes everything uncertain. I wrote what she needed written. Or what someone wanted written, Purbright murmured. Broughton swallowed tightly. Someone was watching Serena then. I didn't know who, but she received letters. She hid them. She said Edgar's death was her fault, then denied saying so. I told her she needed rest. She told me to forget it. And you did, Purbright said, conveniently. For her sake, Inspector. Or for yours. Broughton flinched. Purbright softened his tone. I don't accuse you of malice, but you concealed ambiguity, and someone else built a scheme upon that concealment. We must now determine who. Broughton nodded miserably. Serena wasn't the only one who received letters. I did too. Anonymous. I burned them. What did they say? Purbright asked. That Edgar's death wasn't what it seemed, and that if I spoke otherwise I would be exposed as incompetent. Purbright sighed softly. Fear is a remarkable silencer. He straightened. Doctor, I need you to tell me something with absolute honesty. When Serena came to you 5 years ago, after the funeral, did she say Edgar's name in the same tone she used at the parish hall this week? A haunted expression crossed Broughton's face. Yes, he whispered. Exactly the same. Purbright exhaled slowly. That settled it. Serena's fear had not begun with a whisper in the hedge. It had begun with a voice she already knew. Doctor, he said, I must speak with Serena now. Broughton looked alarmed. She's fragile. She has been fragile for 5 years because a truth was kept from her, Purbright said. And someone has decided it's time to break her open entirely. I will not allow that. He left the surgery before Broughton could argue further. Outside, the dusk lay heavy over Flaxborough, muffling sound and lending the streets a muted, expectant air. Purbright walked briskly toward Candlewick Lane, his coat brushing against the wind, his mind assembling the final alignment of clues. When he reached Serena's cottage, he found Chubb waiting with a small metal box in his hands, mud-caked, battered, freshly unearthed. We found it where the nephew said, Chubb whispered. Purbright nodded. Good work. Should I open it? No, not yet. He knocked softly on Serena's door. After a moment it opened a crack. Serena looked out, eyes rimmed red, face pale but steady. Inspector, she murmured, may I come in? She hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Purbright placed the metal box on her table, but did not open it. Instead, he sat across from her, leaning forward slightly. Mrs. Bletchley, he said gently, it is time to tell you something, and time for you to tell me something in return. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. Someone has been trying to frighten you, he continued. Someone who knows the past you tried to bury. Not Edgar, not a ghost, a person with intention. Serena trembled. I never wanted it, any of it, to return. Purbright held her gaze. Who? He asked softly. Did you bury in your garden 5 years ago? What truth did you hide there? Tears welled in her eyes, not sudden but inevitable. The box on the table seemed to pulse with unspoken weight. Serena drew a breath, thin and fragile. Not Edgar, she whispered. Not Edgar at all. And Purbright knew the final door had opened. For a long moment, Serena Bletchley sat without speaking, her fingers trembling on the edge of the shawl as though gripping the last threads of a life she had constructed carefully enough to pass for peace. The small metal box on the table between them seemed to flicker in her peripheral vision, but she couldn't bring herself to look at it. Relief and dread warred behind her eyes, the slow breaking of a dam too long strained. It wasn't Edgar in the river, she whispered finally. Not Edgar. Henry came back that year, not to reconcile, not even to visit. He wanted money, Edgar's money, though Edgar hardly had any to spare. And when Edgar refused, Henry threatened him, threatened us both. Purbright said nothing, allowing the words to find their own path. He was cruel, Serena continued faintly. Cruel in that quiet way that makes people doubt you when you speak of it. Edgar tried to keep him away from me, but Henry knew how to twist things, how to make fear feel like guilt. And the night Henry died? Purbright said softly. She closed her eyes. It was raining. Edgar had gone to meet him at the old siding, hoping to persuade him to leave for good. I followed, not because Edgar asked me to, but because I feared what Henry might do. Her voice faltered. She steadied it. They were arguing when I arrived. Henry shouted something about taking whatever he wanted from us. Edgar tried to walk away. Henry struck him. I pushed Henry aside. He stumbled, fell, hit his head on the edge of the bench. I didn't realize he was dead until Edgar knelt beside him and... She clasped her hands to stop them from shaking. Edgar panicked, not for himself, for me. He said no one would believe it was an accident. He said Henry had enough enemies that the police might see a motive everywhere. He begged me to let him take the blame quietly. Purbright's gaze softened, though he didn't interrupt her. He dragged Henry's body to the river, Serena whispered. He thought if people believed it was Edgar who drowned, they would stop asking after Henry. And it worked. Too well. The body was unrecognizable. Everyone assumed Edgar was gone. I didn't correct them. I let the town bury a man who wasn't mine to mourn. And Edgar? Purbright prompted gently. Her lips quivered into something between a smile and a wound. He left town, vanished. He said he would write, but the letters grew fewer, then stopped. Perhaps he feared returning, or perhaps he feared becoming like his brother. I never knew. Purbright glanced at the metal box. And what did you bury? She nodded toward it, weary. Henry's wallet, his watch, The cufflinks Edgar removed before placing him in the river. We couldn't burn them, couldn't keep them, so I hid them. Both of us did. Edgar thought if the truth ever surfaced, it would ruin me. And those letters you received afterwards? Purbright asked. She inhaled unsteadily. They arrived every few months at first. Tiny notes, no threats, just reminders. You kept the wrong secret. Or Henry deserved better. I thought perhaps Henry had an acquaintance in town, someone who knew he'd returned, someone who noticed he'd disappeared again. And recently, Purbright pressed, her eyes clouded. The letters came again this year, more frequent. One said, "Only you let the wrong man drown." I thought, perhaps someone knew everything. Purbright considered her for a moment, his voice quiet when he spoke. "Mrs. Bletchley, the man whispering outside your home was not Edgar. And he was not a ghost of Henry. He was someone who wanted to use your fear, not your truth." Serena looked up at him, something like relief flickering behind the exhaustion. "Do you know who?" "I believe so." Purbright rose. "And I believe he will come to you again if given the chance." She trembled. "What should I do?" "Nothing," Purbright said gently. "For now." He carried the metal box with him as he left the cottage, stepping into the dimming evening where Candlewick Lane had begun its slow retreat into shadows. Chubb waited near the gate, sombre and patient. "You heard?" Purbright asked. Chubb nodded. "Enough." "Good. Bring this to the station, lock it securely, and send word for Dr. Broughton to meet me at the council chamber." "You think he's the one?" Chubb asked, shocked. Purbright shook his head. "No, but he knows the one." At the station, under the cold glow of the lamps, Purbright laid out the photograph fragments, the gloves, the timetable. They formed a map with a missing centre. But the pattern was clear enough now. A quiet knock sounded at the door. Broughton stepped inside, shoulders drawn, face pale. "You said it was urgent," he murmured. "It is," Purbright replied. "We need to speak of Henry Felpish, and of someone else, someone who has been pulling threads around Serena for months." Broughton sank into a chair as Purbright continued. "You told me you burned the letters you received. You lied, not by much, but enough." Broughton's face flushed. You kept one," Purbright said calmly. "In your desk drawer where you thought it safe. I found it earlier. It was signed only with an initial. F. That initial belongs to someone who knew both brothers, someone who visited your surgery last winter, someone with a talent for appearing at the edges of things, never quite seen, never quite absent." Broughton swallowed. "Martin?" "No," Purbright said quietly. "Harold Scholes?" The doctor blinked, stunned. "Scholes? But why would he?" Purbright walked slowly to the window, watching the lamplight ripple across the street. "Scholes knew Henry returned. He saw him at the station, yet said nothing. He also knew Henry disappeared again. Perhaps Henry owed him money. Perhaps they had dealings we will never fully know. What matters is that Scholes recognized the body in the river was not Edgar." Broughton stared, horrified. "Then, all these years—" "Scholes believed Serena helped Edgar vanish," Purbright said. "And in doing so cost Scholes something. Respect, reputation, or simply an old grudge he never forgave. But the whispering. Scholes knew Serena walked lightly and feared shadows," Purbright replied. "He used that. He wanted her to break, perhaps to confess, perhaps simply to suffer." Broughton rubbed his face. He watched Edgar at the station. He watched Serena bury the box. He watched everything. "Yes," Purbright said, "and now he will answer for it." What followed required no flourish, no dramatics. Purbright and Chubb went to Scholes's flat, where they found him sitting at his table with an empty teacup, as though expecting their arrival. He did not resist. He did not confess. He merely said, "She should have told the truth," as they led him away. The town learned only the polite portion of the affair, that Mr. Scholes had been involved in distressing conduct, that Serena suffered unfortunate disturbances, that Inspector Pubright had resolved a delicate matter involving old grievances and mistaken identity. Flaxborough preferred its mysteries neatly folded. In the days that followed, Serena regained her calm. She tended her garden, wrote a letter she never sent, and stopped waking before dawn. Broughton resumed his rounds with quieter humility. The sewing circle returned to discussing hems instead of hauntings. And Purbright, at last, sat before his paperwork with a faint, weary satisfaction. Another small truth had been unearthed, another quiet life restored to equilibrium. Outside, the river moved on beneath the stone bridge, indifferent, steady, carrying the past with it as gently as silt. Flaxborough breathed again.